The restaurant was quiet, the kind of quiet that costs money. She realized something was wrong. The man sitting there wasn't the one she came to meet. He was looking at the menu with a small boy beside him, completely unbothered, completely unaware that a woman worth $4 billion had just stopped breathing for half a second in the middle of a room she thought she controlled. To understand why that moment broke her open, you have to understand who Ava Monroe was before she walked through that door. There was a thermostat on the wall of Ava Monroe's bedroom, set permanently to 67 degrees. Not 66, not 68, 67. The precise temperature her sleep tracker had determined would give her the most productive rest. She had optimized her morning routine down to the minute, her calendar color-coded across 4 time zones, her meals planned by a nutritionist who sent weekly menus with no room for improvisation. Every variable in her life had been identified, measured, and controlled. She was 38 years old, worth $4 billion, and had not slept past 6 in the morning in over a decade. From the outside, Ava Monroe looked like a woman who had built exactly the life she wanted. Her company, Monroe Capital Group, a real estate and technology conglomerate she had grown from a single distressed property acquisition at 26 occupied 2 floors of the tallest building in the city. Her name appeared on Forbes lists, without her having to do anything except exist and keep compounding. People described her with the same handful of words: brilliant, precise, formidable. A journalist once wrote that being in a meeting with Ava Monroe felt like standing in front of a scanner. She took in everything and gave away nothing. What the journalist didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that the scanner had been running on empty for years. Ava had not always been this way. There was a version of her briefly at 19 who had been something closer to soft. A girl who had believed, despite every reasonable piece of evidence, that someone could look at her and want her specifically, not the family name behind her or the future she represented. His name wasn't worth remembering now. What mattered was the sequence of events. Her father's company collapsed. The debts surfaced one after another like things drowned that refused to stay down, and the boy she had thought was different left within a week. He didn't say goodbye in person. He left a ring on her kitchen table, a small, inexpensive ring she had once held like it was precious, and walked out of an apartment she would lose 3 months later. Ava did not cry. Not then, not after. What she did instead was something far more permanent. She decided that the problem had never been him. The problem was that she had given him something to leave with. She had handed a stranger the ability to unmake her, and he had used it without hesitation. She spent the years that followed making sure that would never happen again. She was not cold. She would have told you if you asked. She was efficient. Coldness was an emotion. What Ava had cultivated was the absence of exposure. She kept her days full and her evenings structured. She had colleagues she respected and employees she treated well. She had a trusted assistant named Claire, who had worked beside her for 7 years and knew her well enough to order her coffee without asking. What she did not have was anyone who could reach her in the place she had decided quietly and completely to wall off. At 38, in the top-floor corner office of a building she owned, Ava Monroe looked out at a city spread beneath her like something she had already accounted for and felt absolutely nothing she could name. Across the city, in a neighborhood where the buildings were lower and the streets smelled like cut grass and motor oil, a man named Daniel Okafor was on his knees in a woodworking shop at 7 in the evening, running his thumb along the grain of a walnut board and deciding it wasn't right yet. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that told the whole story of what he did for a living. He had grown up in Atlanta, the son of Nigerian immigrants, who had made their life with careful hands and careful savings, and he had inherited both the steadiness and the work ethic without trying. His shop was small, a converted garage space he rented near the east side, but the pieces he made out of it had found their way into restaurants, boutique hotels, and the living rooms of people who didn't know his name, but ran their hands across his tables and felt something they couldn't quite explain. Daniel Okafor was not wealthy. He was something rarer, a man who had found the thing he was genuinely good at and had organized his life around it without apology. He had been married once to a woman named Maya who had laughed at full volume and cooked Sunday dinners that lasted 3 hours and loved him in the specific, unhurried way of someone who had chosen deliberately and never doubted the choice. Maya had been gone for 4 years now, pancreatic cancer diagnosed, late fought, hard lost anyway. They had 3 years from diagnosis to the end, which was both more time than some people get and not even close to enough. In those 3 years, Daniel had learned to cook, to braid hair, to check homework, to hold a household together with both hands, while also quietly falling apart in the car on the way home from the hospital where no one could see. After she died, he kept moving. There was no other option that made sense. His son needed breakfast and clean clothes and someone to show up at school performances and look proud, so Daniel showed up. He made breakfast. He looked proud. And on the evenings after his son was asleep, he sat in the small back room of the house with his acoustic guitar and played until the tightness in his chest loosened enough to let him breathe again. His son's name was Marcus, 8 years old, gap-toothed, direct in the manner of children who have been raised by someone who told them the truth. Marcus was the kind of child who asked questions in full sentences and remembered the answers. He was by any measure doing well, more than well, which was the thing Daniel held on to on the harder nights. There were 2 things Daniel did for himself outside of the shop and outside of fatherhood. The first was the guitar. The second was a Thursday night class at the community college Introduction to Interior Design, which he had enrolled in, not to reinvent himself, but because he wanted to understand the spaces his furniture would eventually inhabit. He wanted to be better at what he already loved. That was all. He was not looking for anything else. He had not been looking for anything else in 4 years. What he was underneath the steadiness and the routine and the careful life he had rebuilt was a man who still set 2 coffee cups out of habit some mornings before catching himself. A man who, when his son asked one evening whether Ba was happy, had looked at the boy for a long moment and said, "I'm working on it," because it was the most honest answer he had. The meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon in October in a conference room on the 42nd floor, with a view so pristine it looked like a screensaver. Richard Halston, Monroe Capital's longest-serving board member and the man who had co-signed Ava's first acquisition when she was 26, and everyone else thought she was too young and too unproven, set a single-page memo on the table between them. He did not make a show of it. That was the thing about Richard. He delivered bad news with the same tone he delivered good news, which somehow made it worse. The memo outlined what his communications consultant had framed as a perception risk. The company was 18 months from its initial public offering, the IPO that would be the largest in Monroe Capital's history, and a milestone Ava had been building toward for a decade. The consultant had run the numbers, studied the investor profiles, and arrived at a conclusion that Richard was now relaying with the kind of careful neutrality that meant he agreed with it but didn't want to own it. Institutional investors in their target bracket skewed conservative. A CEO with no visible personal life, no partner, no anchoring outside the company, that profile read in certain rooms as a liability. Not a deal breaker. A liability. Ava read the memo twice. Then she set it face down on the table. She did not argue. Arguing would have meant the memo had touched something, and she had trained herself out of that kind of reaction years ago. Instead, she said she would think about it, thanked Richard for bringing it to her attention, and spent the 45-minute drive home running the logic in her head with the same detachment she would apply to a property valuation. The numbers were what they were. Perception was a variable. Variables could be managed. Over the next 2 months, 3 meetings were arranged through a high-end matchmaking firm that handled introductions for executives who valued discretion. 3 men, all impeccably credentialed, arrived at 3 different restaurants at 3 different times with the careful energy of people auditioning for a role they had prepared for. The conversations were polished and bloodless. Ava checked her watch during each one, not obviously just a glance, and by the 45-minute mark she had already decided. She did not dislike any of them. She simply felt nothing that could not be replicated by a competent business lunch. She told Claire the third one hadn't worked. Claire, who had spent 7 years watching Ava solve impossible problems and deflect personal ones, looked at her employer for a moment with the expression of someone about to do something inadvisable. Then Claire said she had another idea. Not a firm, not a profile. A blind date through an app, the kind that matched on conversation style before revealing anything else. No background check, no research. Just sitting across from a stranger for an hour with no information and no agenda. Ava said no immediately. Claire waited 2 weeks and mentioned it again. Ava said it was inefficient. Claire waited another week and said quietly that maybe efficiency wasn't the point. Ava agreed on a Tuesday. She told herself it was because she had exhausted the other options and this was the only remaining data point worth collecting. She told herself she was going because she wanted to be able to say she had tried everything. She did not examine whether there was any other reason. She made a reservation for 7:30. She planned what she would wear 3 days in advance. She prepared, as she always did, an exit line polite final, impossible to misread. "Thank you for your time. I'll be in touch." She had used it 11 times in the past 4 years. She was fully prepared to use it a 12th time. She arrived 15 minutes early, which was not a habit born of eagerness, but of control. Being early meant she could choose where to stand, what to observe, how to position herself, before anyone else had the chance to position her. It was a small advantage, but Ava had built a $4 billion company on the accumulation of small advantages. The restaurant was the kind of place that understood discretion, low lighting tables, spaced generously apart staff who had learned to make themselves invisible until they were needed. She stood at the bar near the entrance and ordered sparkling water, and did what she always did in unfamiliar rooms. She read it. The service flow, the acoustics, the sight lines. The semi-private room at the back, separated from the main dining area by a frosted glass partition, was reserved for guests who had called ahead for privacy. The app she had used directed its bookings there. Everything logged under generated code names to protect users who could not afford to be recognized. She had received a confirmation that morning. Table for 2. 7:30. She knew her date's first name, only the app revealed that much and nothing more. His name was Trevor. Ava looked at her watch. 7:22. She ran through the exit line one more time. Clean. Final. Kind enough. She had used it so many times, it no longer felt like a sentence. It felt like a door closing. What she did not run through because she did not allow herself to was the quieter thought that had surfaced twice in the car on the way here, and that she had both times redirected the thought that she was tired. Not tired in the way that sleep fixed. Tired in the way that had no category in any of her optimization systems, the kind that showed up not as exhaustion, but as a persistent, low-level awareness that all the efficiency in the world had not produced anything that felt like enough. The host appeared at her elbow. "Ms. Monroe, your table is ready." She followed him toward the back of the room. The semi-private room was just ahead when the host gestured toward it and stepped aside. Through the frosted glass partition, she could make out the silhouette of someone already seated at the table. She stepped through the partition and knew within 2 seconds that this was not Trevor. The man sitting across from her was black, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his early 40s, wearing a navy button-down that was neat but not expensive. He was holding a menu with the particular expression of someone encountering something written in a language they technically speak but have never used conversationally, one eyebrow slightly raised, mouth set in a line of careful assessment. A young boy sat beside him, occupied with a glass of water and a small paper airplane. He appeared to be engineering from a cocktail napkin. The man looked up when she entered. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The host, still unaware that anything was wrong, set 2 additional menus on the table and said he would give them a moment, then disappeared. The man looked at Ava, then at the chair across from him. then back at Ava with the calm of someone who had decided there was no version of this situation worth being dramatic about. "I think we've both got the wrong table," he said. His voice was even unhurried. "I'm waiting on a colleague. He was supposed to meet me out in the main room, but one of the staff brought us back here. I didn't argue because the kid was getting restless." He glanced at the boy, who was now watching Ava with frank curiosity. "I'm guessing whoever you came to meet isn't me." Ava opened her mouth. She had the exit line ready. It needed only minor adjustment. What came out instead was nothing, because in the half-second before she spoke something small and inconvenient happened, she noticed that he had not looked at her the way people usually looked at her. There was no recognition, no recalibration, no subtle shift in posture that meant he had identified who she was and was now deciding what to do with that information. He was just looking at her the way a person looks at another person, directly without agenda. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her that way. "The air conditioning is better in here than out there," he added without particular emphasis. "You're welcome to sit while you sort it out. I'm not going anywhere until my colleague shows up or I figure out what a deconstructed risotto actually is, whichever comes first." Ava sat down. She could not have explained why exactly. She would think about it later more than once, and the only answer she would arrive at was that she had spent so many years knowing in advance how every room she walked into would end, and for reasons she had not yet identified, she did not know how this one would. That uncertainty, which should have sent her straight back to the bar and out the front door, did something else entirely. It made her stay in the chair. "It's rice," she said. He looked up from the menu. "Deconstructed risotto," she said. "It's risotto where the components are plated separately. The rice, the reduction, the garnish, same dish, different assembly." He looked at the menu again, then back at her. "So they charge you more to do less work." "Essentially." "Huh." He set the menu down, apparently satisfied. "I'm Daniel." "Ava." He nodded the way someone nods when they've received information that doesn't require a reaction, and picked up his water glass. The conversation that followed was not the conversation Ava had prepared for. There was no agenda to it, no negotiation dressed as small talk, no careful architecture of impression management. Daniel asked her whether she had been to the restaurant before she had twice for client dinners, and he told her his colleague had recommended it, which was why he was slightly unprepared for the price point. He said this without embarrassment, the way he might mention that it was raining outside. Ava found herself explaining the menu in a way she had never done before, not as a performance of knowledge, but because he asked follow-up questions with the straightforward curiosity of someone who was actually interested in the answers. When she described a dish with a sauce reduction that took 6 hours to make, he thought about it seriously and said that sounded like something he'd want to eat exactly once, just to understand it, and then probably go home and make pasta. She almost laughed. It came out smaller than a laugh, just a shift in her breath, a slight loosening around her mouth, but it was real and it surprised her. The boy, who had finished his paper airplane and apparently decided the adults were now interesting enough to engage, looked at Ava with complete directness. "Hi," he said. "Are you my dad's friend?" Daniel said. "This is Ava. She sat at the wrong table." "By accident?" "By accident," Daniel confirmed. The boy considered this. "That's okay. Dad sat in someone else's car once because it looked like ours." Daniel said with great dignity, "That was one time." "Twice," the boy said. He extended his hand to Ava with the solemnity of someone who had been taught that introductions mattered. "I'm Marcus." Ava shook his hand. Her chest did something she did not have a word for. Daniel's colleague sent a text stuck in traffic 30 more minutes, sorry. Daniel read it, put his phone face down on the table, and looked at his son, who had already picked up the dessert menu and was studying it with the focus of a professional. "Can I get the chocolate thing?" Marcus asked. "Which chocolate thing?" "The one with the French name I can't say." "You'll have to point to it." Ava's phone vibrated on the table. She turned it over, a reflex from 1,000 dinners where a message had redirected her evening. The notification was from the app. A message from Trevor's account sent 4 minutes ago. Something came up, have to cancel. We'll reschedule. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down face down the same way Daniel had placed his. Across the table, Daniel was helping Marcus sound out the name of the dessert, his voice low and patient, one large hand resting on the back of his son's chair. He was not watching her. He was not waiting for her reaction. He was just there, entirely present in the ordinary way of a man who had learned out of necessity to be fully in whatever moment he was standing in. Ava could leave. The reason she had come was gone. There was nothing keeping her in this chair except the absence of a reason to stand. She caught the eye of a passing server. "Can we get some water for the table?" she said, "and whatever dessert the young man is pointing at." Marcus pointed. The server nodded. Daniel looked at Ava, not with surprise exactly, but with the careful attention of someone recalibrating a situation. He didn't say thank you. He just held her gaze for a moment, steady and unhurried, in a way that felt less like gratitude and more like acknowledgement, like he was simply noting that she had chosen to stay and that this was worth noticing. It was the most seen Ava Monroe had felt in a very long time. She told herself it was a coincidence. 1 week after the restaurant, Ava walked into a furniture showroom in the design district to source reference materials for a new office renovation, something her interior lead had requested textures and finishes, nothing she needed to be present for, but had chosen to handle herself for reasons she did not examine. The showroom carried handcrafted pieces from independent makers. On the workmanship tag of a walnut credenza near the back wall, she read the name of the shop, Okafor Workshop, East Side. She stood there for a moment. Then she asked the showroom manager for contact information. She called the shop the following morning and said she was looking for a custom bookshelf for a residential space. The call was answered by Daniel himself, who did not seem surprised to hear from her, which surprised her. He came to the penthouse 3 days later to take measurements. He moved through the apartment the way he moved through everything, unhurried, observant, running his hand along the existing shelving to understand the material before he committed to anything. He asked her 2 or 3 focused questions about how she actually used the space, what she kept closest to her desk, whether she cared more about capacity or visual proportion. Nobody had ever asked her how she used her own apartment before. When he left, she stood in the room for longer than she needed to and thought about the way he had said before he walked out that Walnut would be wrong for the light in that corner too dark and that he'd work up an option in white oak instead unless she had a strong preference otherwise. He had not asked if that was okay. He had just told her what he thought and trusted her to agree or push back. She did not push back. The bookshelf took 3 weeks. He delivered it on a Saturday morning, and she found herself at the door at 8:45 without knowing she'd planned to be there. He brought Marcus, who walked in, looked at the ceiling height in the entryway, and announced that the apartment was very tall and very white and that it did not look like anybody lived there. Daniel said, "Marcus." Marcus said, "I'm just saying." Ava looked around her own apartment, a space she had curated with an architect. Over 18 months, every surface intentional, every object vetted and understood with a clarity that was almost annoying that the child was right. Over the following 2 weeks, they met 3 times. Once when Daniel stopped by to check the shelving alignment. Once when Ava, walking near his neighborhood on a route she had not previously taken, found him and Marcus in a small park off the main street and sat down on the bench beside them without an invitation, and neither of them asked for an explanation. Once when she commissioned a second piece, a side table she did not strictly need, because she recognized it for what it was, and decided for once not to pretend otherwise. She also recognized something else which disturbed her more. She had started noticing when her phone showed a message from Daniel differently than she noticed other messages. A fraction of a second of something before she read it. She did not have a clean word for the feeling. What she did have was a well-trained instinct that identified it immediately and began running its standard countermeasures, extra hours of work, an earlier morning, a weekend trip to a development site in another city that could have waited another month. The countermeasures were slower than usual. That was the part that alarmed her most. Daniel, for his part, was not moving quickly either. He told his closest friend over the phone one evening that he liked Ava in a way he had not liked anyone since Maya, which was enough to produce a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind that meant the person listening was paying full attention. What Daniel also said was that he wasn't sure it made any sense. He said it without self-pity, the way he said everything like a man describing a measurement that didn't quite line up. He said it plainly her world and his world weren't two floors of the same building. They were two different buildings on two different sides of the city. What he kept private, the part that had nothing to do with money or status, was the other weight he carried. If he let Marcus get attached, let his son start expecting someone to be there, and then that person left, he would have to explain it to an 8-year-old who had already had to accept one person not coming back. He was not willing to hand that particular wound to his child without being very sure of what he was doing. So he moved carefully, and he watched, and he waited to understand what Ava Monroe actually wanted. Not the version of her that ordered furniture she didn't need, but the version that was underneath all of that, in the place she hadn't yet shown anyone. The information came to her by accident, the way the most consequential things often did. She was in a Monday morning briefing when a name came up in the context of a competing bid. Trevor Hale, senior partner at a firm, now representing a group of investors with an interest in one of Monroe Capital's target properties. Ava noted it moved on, and the meeting ended 40 minutes later. On her way back to her office, something surfaced, not urgent, just present, and she asked Claire to pull a background note on Hale. Claire sent it over that afternoon. The profile was standard Harvard Law notable transactions, a professional reputation, built on being useful to powerful people. It was the kind of resume that explained exactly why he had appeared in the app's matchmaking pool, polished, credentialed, exactly the type the algorithm would surface for someone with her profile. And at the bottom of Claire's note, a single line added out of thoroughness, same Trevor Hale from the Veritas app match canceled evening of October 14th. Ava read it again. Then she called the restaurant manager directly and asked a straightforward question: had there been anything unusual about the reservation log for the semi-private room on the evening of October 14th? The manager was apologetic. He explained that a newer staff member had redirected a walk-in guest toward the private area by mistake, and he also hesitated before adding that the cancellation from her app contact had come through the concierge line approximately 18 minutes before her arrival. 18 minutes. After she was already in the car, she had a researcher make 2 calls. What came back was brief and sufficient. Trevor Hale had received a photograph taken from the restaurant's lobby area and forwarded through a mutual contact as a casual heads-up showing a black man near the private room. The message attached had been something like, "Is that who you're meeting?" And Hale had responded by canceling through the app without a word of explanation. Ava set the summary down on her desk. The words were simple. The meaning was exact. A man who looked like Daniel had been in the vicinity of her reservation, and Trevor Hale had decided on that basis alone that he would not keep the appointment. What struck her, and it was not a comfortable thing to sit with, was the question of what she would have done a year earlier if she had received that same photograph and that same message. She had not thought of herself as someone who carried those assumptions. She had built a company on the premise that she evaluated everything on its merits. But the question pressed against her in a way she couldn't redirect. In the world she had moved through for nearly 2 decades, had she ever stopped to look at which assumptions she had simply never bothered to examine? She did not like the answer that came back. It was not something she could optimize or put in a column. It was the specific discomfort of a person realizing that the mirror she had trusted had not been showing her the full picture. She did not tell Daniel about any of this right away. What she did was carry it with her the way you carry something that belongs to you and that you owe it to yourself and to someone else to reckon with eventually. The invitation was Ava's idea, which meant it was also her responsibility. Monroe Capital's annual investor reception was the most significant social event on the company calendar, not a party in any real sense, but a room full of people who held enormous influence over the trajectory of her company's next chapter. Ava had attended everyone alone for a decade. This year, 6 weeks after a man had sat beside her in a park without being asked and talked about wood grain for 20 minutes and somehow made it the most interesting conversation she'd had all month. She called Daniel and said she wanted him there. He was quiet for a moment. "As what? As someone I want there," she said. Another moment. Then, okay. He arrived in a charcoal suit that fit him well and made no attempt to be anything other than what it was. He moved through the entrance with the straightforward confidence of a man who understood that rooms like this were designed to make certain people feel like visitors, and who had decided quietly that he was not going to perform discomfort for anyone's benefit. Ava watched him from across the room as a board member named Gerald Webb, silver-haired old money instincts, the kind of man who had been making social calculations since before Ava was born, moved toward Daniel with a glass of champagne and a smile that had just enough warmth to be insulting. She could not hear the exchange from where she stood, but she saw it clearly. Webb gesturing toward the room with a question, Daniel answering Webb's face, cycling through something that resolved into a tight nod. She saw Daniel reach into his jacket pocket, produce a business card, the wooden one, hand-engraved she would learn later, and place it in Webb's hand with the calm of someone who had decided that was the whole of what he owed the moment. She should have crossed the room right then. She knew it even as she stood there. She didn't move. The evening continued. People circulated. Daniel found her near the windows after an hour and stood beside her with a glass of water, not wine, looking out at the city below with an expression she couldn't entirely read. They talked in the low way of two people who were aware they were being watched, but had agreed without discussing it not to perform for the audience. Near the end of the evening, Richard Halston appeared at her elbow. He asked to speak with her privately. She followed him to the edge of the room near the corridor. Richard said what he said carefully, the way he did everything. He said he wanted her to know he wasn't speaking from personal judgment, only from his concern for her and for the company. He said that the man she had brought tonight was clearly, he was sure, a decent person. But the presence of that specific guest in that specific room at this specific moment before the IPO, he wanted her to think about what message it sent. He said, "You know what I mean, Ava?" She did know what he meant. That was the problem. She walked back to find Daniel and found him already by the coat check, his jacket over one arm. His expression not angry, but closed in the way of a man who had made a decision. He said it directly without drama. "I saw you and Halston. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what that conversation was." Ava said, "Daniel." "I'm not asking you to explain it," he said. "I'm telling you something. I've spent 4 years building a life for me and my son that we can both stand inside of with our heads up. I'm not going to put Marcus in a situation where he learns to navigate rooms by making himself smaller. I can't do that." He held her gaze steadily. "So what I need to know, not tonight but eventually, is what you're actually choosing, not what you feel. What you're choosing." He said goodnight. He walked out through the lobby and into the dark, and Ava stood where he had left her in the middle of a room full of people who held her company's future in their hands, and felt something she had not felt since she was 19 years old, the particular silence of having finally opened a door and then watching someone walk away through it, not because they wanted to leave, but because she had not yet found the courage to stand beside them in the doorway. For 3 days after the reception, Ava Monroe ran her company with complete precision. She attended every meeting. She reviewed every contract. She approved 2 acquisitions and declined a third, and her reasoning on all 3 was sound. From the outside, nothing had changed. The calendar was full. The work continued. Claire placed her morning coffee on the desk at 7:55, and Ava drank it without tasting it and moved to the next item on the agenda. On the second night, at 2 in the morning, she opened her laptop at the kitchen island in the penthouse, not the home office, the kitchen which she never used after 9, and sat in the dark with the screen, brightness turned down, and the cursor blinking in an empty search bar. She typed Okafor Workshop East Side and looked at the result for a long moment, and then closed the laptop without clicking anything. On the third day, in the late afternoon, she cleared the rest of her calendar and sat in her office alone and did something she almost never did. She thought about herself honestly, without agenda, without the goal of producing an action item at the end. She thought about Trevor Hale, who had looked at a photograph and decided without hesitation that it was sufficient reason to cancel. She had spent a week carrying quiet outrage about that, and she had been right to. But she had not spent equal time on the question that followed the harder one she had been deflecting with work and logistics. What had she done at the reception when she had the chance to do something? She had stood on the other side of the room. She had watched Gerald Webb perform a condescension so polished it required a lifetime of practice, and she had not moved. And then Richard had stood in her own corridor and told her in language cleaned of its ugliness, but unmistakable in its meaning, that the man she had invited was a liability, and she had let him finish without a word. Not because she agreed. She was clear about that. But she had spent so long in rooms where she had to calculate the cost of every response, what it would mean to push back, who it might destabilize, what capital she would spend, that the calculus had run automatically before she could stop it, and the result had been silence. The same silence she had trained herself into over years of knowing exactly how to protect herself. This time, she had protected the wrong thing. She had protected her position in a room full of investors, instead of protecting the person she had brought into it. She had done in real time a version of what Trevor Hale had done from a safer distance. She had chosen not to act, because acting would have cost her something. The difference between her and Hale was smaller than she had been allowing herself to believe. That was the part that sat in her chest without moving. What she had told herself for years was that she evaluated everything on its merits. She had believed it. It had felt like precision, like fairness. But precision applied only to the things you chose to measure, and she had spent a long time measuring the things that showed up on balance sheets and not examining the ones she had simply absorbed from the rooms she'd been moving through since she was 26, too fast and too focused to stop and look at what the walls were made of. This was not a comfortable thing to hold. It did not come with a solution she could schedule. It was just true, and she was going to have to decide what to do with something true. Daniel had not asked her to be perfect. He had asked her to choose. There was a difference, and it was the most important difference she had come across in a long time. She sat in the office until the sky outside the windows went dark. Then she put her phone in her pocket and left the building and went home and spent the rest of the night in the kitchen where the laptop was still sitting on the counter and thought about what she was actually made of when no one was watching. By Saturday morning, she knew where she was going. She left the car, parked on the main street, and walked the last block to the shop. It was early, not so early that it was presumptuous, but early enough that the neighborhood was still quiet, and the light had the particular quality of a morning that hadn't fully committed yet. The shop door was open by the time she reached it, the way it always was when Daniel was already working. She could hear it before she arrived, the low, even sound of a hand plane moving along wood in long, deliberate strokes. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. He set the plane down on the workbench and stood there and waited. Ava had rehearsed nothing on the way here. That was deliberate. Every important thing she had ever said in her adult life had been prepared, every board presentation, every negotiation, every careful conversation where she needed to control the outcome. She had decided somewhere on the walk from the car that she was not going to do that here. Whatever came out was going to be the actual thing. "I was wrong," she said. "Not about how I felt, about what I did. I stood 20 feet away and watched Webb talk to you like you were there to fix something and I didn't move. And then Richard said what he said and I let him finish." She kept her eyes on Daniel's. "I don't have a good reason for that. I have a familiar one, which is that I've been calculating the cost of every response in rooms like that for so long it happens before I can stop it. But that's an explanation, not an excuse. You were my guest. I should have been beside you." Daniel was quiet. He looked at her in the way she had come to recognize fully without the hurry to respond that most people had. "The thing you said," he replied at last, "about calculating the cost. Do you understand why you were doing that?" "I've been thinking about it for 3 days," she said. "I understand it better than I did. I don't think I'm finished understanding it." He nodded slowly. "That's probably the most honest thing you've said to me." It was not forgiveness handed over in a moment. What it was, she thought, was a man deciding whether she was someone worth the slow work of trust and extending provisionally something he did not give easily. He said they could take it slowly. Not the formal, managed version of slowly not scheduled dinners in semi-private rooms, but the ordinary kind. Coffee on weekend mornings. A Saturday afternoon now and then. Marcus already liked her, which Daniel said was not a small thing, and which Ava understood in the full weight of its meaning was the highest endorsement she had been offered in years. She agreed. She did not ask for more than that. For someone who had spent 2 decades negotiating for maximum position, the restraint felt strange but not uncomfortable. It felt, if she was being precise about it, like choosing correctly. She stayed for an hour that morning, sitting on a wooden stool near the workbench while Daniel finished what he was doing. They talked some and were quiet some. Near the end of the hour, with the morning fully arrived and the light coming through the shop's high-side window in a clean, warm angle, Daniel set down his tools and picked up the guitar from the corner of the room, not performing just the natural reach of a man who did this every day, and played something without a name to it, quiet and unhurried, that moved through the room like light moves through a window without effort, without announcement. Ava sat still and listened. She did not check her phone. She did not inventory her afternoon. She just sat in a room that smelled like sawdust and wood oil and listened to a man play something he had never tried to explain to anyone and understood without needing to analyze it that this was the place she wanted to be. The IPO closed on a Thursday in March on a day that started gray and turned bright by noon. Ava stood on the stage at the exchange in a room full of people who had bet on her company and won, and she delivered the remarks she had written herself in plain language without the polish that her communications team had suggested. She thanked the people who had built Monroe Capital alongside her. She talked about what the company had started as and what it had become. She did not mention a partner or a relationship or anything that resembled the image management exercise that had set all of this in motion. Richard Halston found her afterward in the corridor, and he shook her hand and said it had gone well, and she thanked him. And then she picked up her coat and walked out of the building alone and got into the car and told the driver to take her east. Several months later, on a Sunday morning that held the last warmth of the season before the cold came in, Ava sat across from Daniel in a coffee shop 3 blocks from his neighborhood. It was the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu and no dress code more complex than be a person. Marcus sat beside his father working through a hot chocolate with the focused application of someone who had earned it. The table they were sitting at was small, wooden, slightly uneven on one leg. Daniel had noticed when they sat down and fixed it without comment by folding a napkin and tucking it beneath the short leg. Ava had watched him do it and thought that this was the kind of thing she never would have thought to do, would have simply noted the instability and sat with it, and that she was still months in learning the specific language of a person who moved through the world with his hands. Marcus looked up from his hot chocolate and said in the manner of a child who had been thinking about something for a while and decided it was time to raise it. "Dad told me you sat at the wrong table when you first met. Was it really an accident?" "It was," Ava said. Marcus considered this. "Then how come everything worked out?" Ava looked at him at the gap in his teeth and the directness of his eyes and the complete confidence he had that this was a reasonable question to ask. Then she looked at Daniel, who was watching her with the quiet expression of a man who already knew there was no clean answer, and was curious what she would do with that. "I think," she said, "the table was wrong for the plans I had made. But sometimes what you planned and what you needed are two completely different things." Marcus thought about that for a moment. "Like when I wanted the superhero backpack, but the one Dad picked turned out to be better." Daniel said, "Thank you. It has more pockets," Marcus said with complete finality and returned to his hot chocolate. Ava looked at the surface of the wooden table, ordinary grain, no particular character, the kind of table in the kind of room where nothing significant was supposed to happen. She thought about a night in October when she had walked into a restaurant with an exit line already loaded and a plan she was ready to execute, and had instead sat down across from a stranger because the air conditioning was better. She had built everything in her life on the principle that the right outcome required the right plan. She had controlled variables and eliminated uncertainty and optimized every room she walked into. And then one table had been wrong, and she had stayed in her chair instead of standing, and the thing she had spent so long deciding she didn't need had walked into the room in a navy button-down and looked at her like she was just a person. She had no formula for what came after. She had tried to build one in the first weeks, and the attempt had been almost comic in its inadequacy. What she had instead was a Sunday morning of coffee. She hadn't optimized a child explaining the merits of a backpack, and a man beside her who had asked her once not to be perfect but to choose. She had chosen. She was still choosing. It turned out that was the whole of it. The morning light came through the window at a low angle and settled on the surface of the wooden table like it belonged there, warm and unhurried, the same as everything else in the room. Outside, the city moved through its Sunday with no awareness of what was happening in this particular corner of it. And inside, 3 people sat around a slightly unsteady table that no one had planned on in a moment that had not been on any calendar and were exactly where they were supposed to be. And maybe that's the thing none of us talk about enough, how the moments that actually change us are almost never the ones we scheduled. Not the carefully arranged dinner. Not the perfect match on paper. Not the plan that made sense to everyone in the room. It's the table we sat down at by accident. The conversation we almost didn't have. The door we almost didn't walk back through. If this story made you feel something, whether it was something you recognized, something you've been carrying, or just a quiet reminder that it's okay to stay in the chair even when you don't know how it ends, we'd really love to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Tell us what hit you. And if you know someone who's been playing it safe for too long, maybe send this their way. Sometimes that's all it takes. We'll see you in the next one.